appreciate it. Look, I don't want to keep you guys long, but I do want to keep you guys involved. You're here for a reason. You're here because, well, the Bucks are playing at 9. We'll hopefully get out of here by then. You're here because somebody asked you to come here. You're here because you told Gene Roberts you'd come here. I think you're here because you firmly believe in this country, you firmly believe in the political process, and you firmly believe that one individual can and will make a difference. In 1992, I had the privilege of chairing this executive committee. We had just elected Charles Kennedy as our first Republican congressman, who succeeded Andy Ireland. But we were working on trying to find out how we're going to get the county commission Republican, the legislative Republican. Senator Dockery and I worked together back in 1992 with an organization called Victory 92. Betty, you were there. Some of you all were there. And we were motivated by our patriotism, by our love for this country, but by our principles. And what I want to do, and I want to do this in an expeditious fashion so I don't keep you late this evening, but I want to reinforce 5 fundamental principles that have been the basis of the Republican Party, because no matter how many times we say them, no matter how many times we discuss them, if we never practice them, we're not Republicans. We're not conservatives. And it's like brushing your teeth. If you only had to do it once, that would be great. But you got to do it a couple times a day. And it doesn't hurt to reinforce the principles that took us from a minority in the 90s to a majority in 2000. Now, after I talk to you about these principles, I then want to talk to you about where we go from here and how we go from here. And I'm going to do this in 20 minutes, I promise, or less. First of all, we talk about less government. That's one of our principles. We've mentioned that so many times. Now, granted, as a practice, the Republicans have not always been the best in less government. We saw that over the last 8 years. We saw it even before then. But if we firmly believe that an individual is going to have the opportunity to be all that they feel that they have been given to be, we need to have less government in our lives telling us what we need to be. For example, let's talk about spending. People say we'll never get out of recession unless we have spending. Therefore, we're going to appropriate money from the government and spend it where we see fit in order to get the economy back. Well, they're right on one part. Spending is necessary. But I will tell you, you need to be spending your dollars the way you want to spend your dollars instead of letting the government spend your dollars. So if we can reduce our taxes, every time you buy a good or service, you're voting with that dollar. You are voting with that dollar. Every time we relinquish control of that dollar to the government, we're giving up that property right and that right to vote for what we want. So we've got to practice less government. And if we practice less government, it'll lead us to our second fundamental principle, and that's less government. Less taxes will have less government. We talk about taxes, and I've reversed these, and I apologize. We need to focus on our less taxes to lead us to less government. But if we focus on less government, and if we really practice less government, which means that we don't need to create a new agency to watch over another agency, we don't need to create czars to watch over government agencies or government officials, what we need to do is allow our local school systems to operate the way they ought to operate within their system, because how you educate a child in Polk County is not the same way you educate a child in South Dakota or California or somewhere else. We remove the barrier of larger government and have less government, we're going to have better opportunity for each of us to achieve what I consider to be a third fundamental principle, and that's individual freedoms. Individual freedoms. Every time the government gets in our lives, including our bedrooms, including our businesses, we are limiting our individual freedoms. And the reason I'm very concerned about this is because we see not so much our elected officials, although they do have a tendency to increase government, but we see our agencies, our bureaucracies, reading themselves. Let's take the Department of Energy, for example. Created in the 1970s under the Carter administration to reduce dependence on foreign oil and to regulate the creation and implementation of nuclear power plants. We were 20% dependent on foreign oil back then. We're 60% dependent now. We haven't built a nuclear power plant since the 1980s. We can legislate them out of business and go back to doing what we said we're going to do. But we've limited our individual freedoms by creating more government. Fourth principle, and we all know these, and personal responsibility. We have to be accountable for our actions. And as difficult as that is, because, every one of us is going to make mistakes. And the sooner we acknowledge that we've made a mistake and go back to correct it and assume the responsibility for it and go on, the better off we're going to be. But when we start bailing out or rescuing those who have made irresponsible decisions or made irresponsible investments, we are doing nothing but breeding that same behavior over and over again. Unless the behavior accepts the consequences of its actions, you will never change that behavior. So you've got to have personal responsibility. And when you put these four principles together, it leads us to our fifth principle, which is empowered families. Now, what does empowered families mean? Empowered families means you have the choice of where you want to live, of where you want to educate your child, of where you want to get your health care. You need that choice because the family unit is the strongest unit that our society has. When people go home for holidays, they go home. They don't go to their business clients. They don't go, some of them might want to get away from their families. But we go home because it's the family that empowers us individually. These five fundamental principles, less taxes, less government, more individual freedoms, personal responsibility, and empowered families, were the compass, if you will, for legislative analysis when both Senator Dockery and I were serving in the House of Representatives. They were used to identify legislation to determine whether it really was less taxes, really did reduce government. We lost sight of that. Well, we quit practicing that. We've got to go back to these five fundamental principles before we do anything. Now, let's talk about that. Well, you didn't say anything about gay marriages, or you didn't say anything about abortion. We got to face all this stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, as Republicans, we have an opportunity that we haven't seen since 1984 when President Reagan was in there. And we have that opportunity being presented to us by our current president. And what we're seeing is that no other president other than President Reagan has done more to bring the Republican Party together than this president has today. And if we get bogged down in our social issues, granted, I'll tell you, I think we've got the best agenda on social issues. I think we're absolutely right. I think it's something that will distract us. I think it's something that may divide us. But even though I may disagree with you on 3 issues or 4 issues, if I agree with you on 5, why don't we stay together? And why don't we stick with what we know best, first of all, that got us to the majority in the first place? And that's our fiscal policy. Our fiscal policy works. We learned that from the Reagan era. We're seeing that now. Yesterday in the paper, when the articles came out about the Office of Management Budget saying, whoops, the deficit's really $2 trillion more. Oh, and by the way, we can't sustain it. Now, this is the White House. We can't sustain this deficit unless we raise taxes and cut spending. Ladies and gentlemen, you're here tonight not to listen to me. You're here tonight because you're right. Because you're right about your beliefs. You're right about those principles. And unless we practice those principles, unless we articulate the message, unless we defend what we believe to be right, those 5 principles will go away. When I was asked to speak, I was thinking about, well, what did we do in 1992 when I came in here? We lost the presidency. Congress wasn't doing well. We had to regroup. And I looked at, and I got a book that was really, it was written by Robert Heinlein. I don't know if any of y'all, he was a science fiction writer back in the 40s, 50s. But it was republished in 1992 by a guy who was Jerry Cornell, who was a big Ross Perot supporter. But it's entitled Take Back